So in this video we are going to look at the establishment of this Duma experiment and this new Russian constitution following the 1906 October Manifesto. Now unfortunately that manifesto failed to include any details of what this new constitution should look like. So Sergei Witte and other government officials went about designing a two-house constitutional system. So as you can see from the graphic on the right-hand side, we have a lower chamber, the State Duma. So the lower chamber, we had members elected under a system of indirect voting. What that means is that to have a direct vote in this election, you needed to be a man of over 25 years of age and also in the possession of up to 400 acres of land. Now, obviously, the vast majority of the Russian population didn't meet that second criteria. So what they would do is they would vote for a delegate who would vote in the election on their behalf. So it was like an indirect vote, and so that's the system that was operated in the State Duma. The outcome being deputies were elected for a 5-year term. Right next to that we have the upper chamber. Now the upper chamber, or the State Council, was half elected by the Zemstva and half appointed by the Tsar. So as you can imagine, this is essentially a body of noble representatives, which was aimed at representing, major social and religious groups in Russia. Now what you'll also see is above that you have the government, or the Council of Ministers. These were hand-picked and exclusively appointed by the Tsar. And they were responsible to the crown, not to the Duma. So what we essentially have, even though this is a two-house system, you do have three separate bodies. And what is really worth noting is that all three of these bodies needed to agree in order for legislation to be passed. And similarly, all three of these bodies had the power of a veto. Okay, which is particularly crucial. Now, just as we're on the cusp of a new, fresh Russian constitution, 5 days before the first Duma opened, the Tsar Nicholas II released these fundamental laws. And as you can see, they are an enormous backward step, and they retract from the, if you like, from the general gist of the October Manifesto and the Duma experiment. He just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that he was still the supreme leader of administrative powers, that he was the supreme leader of all foreign relations, the supreme commander of the armed forces. He had sole power to appoint and dismiss ministers in the government. He had the right to overturn judicial verdicts and sentences, and he also had complete control over national expenditure and the Orthodox Church. So as you can imagine, that doesn't leave an awful lot. In addition to this, in Article 9 of this declaration, he stated that no legislative act should come into force without the Tsar's approval. So let's go back to this. We've actually got the lower chamber, the upper chamber, so the State Duma, the State Council, and the Council of Ministers, and the Tsar himself all need to agree for legislation to be passed. How likely do we think that consensus is ever going to be achieved? So let's have a look at the political parties that contested for seats in this first Duma. The chart in front of you has a list of the political parties with some details of each. The one way to read it is the top political parties are the more extreme left wing. As we move down, we get gradually into the centre parties, and then into the right wing, and at the very bottom we have nationalist and religious groupings at the end. So, starting at the left wing, we have the SDs, or the Social Democratic Workers, heavily committed to Marxism, and they split in 1903, and a very famous split, with Bolsheviks being led by Vladimir Lenin and the Mensheviks being led by Yuli Martov. Slightly less to the left, we have the Social Revolutionaries, led by Viktor Chernov, who were keen on the redistribution of land and nationalisation, and they also favoured, quite aggressive terrorist techniques to achieve their aims. Just below that, we have the Labour group, or the Trudovniks, who were a non-revolutionary break away from the social revolutionaries. A little more moderate, a bit more liberal, and didn't quite favour the terrorist techniques of the social revolutionaries. Then we have the Centre Party, the Cadets, Constitutional Democrats led by Pavel Mulyakov, and we'll see how they fare in that first set of elections. Then we have the Octoberists, the Progressists, and then furthest on the right wing we have the Rightists, or the Union of the Russian People. And this was extremely right wing. Favoured monarchism, chauvinism, orthodoxy, pan-Slavism, and anti-Semitism. Promoted violent attacks on the left wing and pogroms through its street fighting gangs, the Black Hundreds. So they're a pretty nasty bunch. So, and then we have obviously the national groups at the bottom there. Okay. So the first Duma, it is opened in very opulent circumstances, as you can see from the image on the screen, and that was opened on the 1st of May 1906 in Turai Palace, St. Petersburg. Clearly the Tsar and his wife in attendance there. It was known and called the Duma of National Hopes because, as we can remember from the October Manifesto, there was a lot of hope riding on this Duma experiment. So, unfortunately, the Bolsheviks, social revolutionaries and the Unionists all refused to participate in the election campaign of the winter of 1905 and 1906. So as a result, if you take those left and right-wing extremes out of it, it resulted in a very centrist, radical, liberal Duma that was heavily dominated by the cadets, and you can see that from the election results in the chart there. More than 191 elected deputies were peasants, and peasant farmers made the biggest professional group. Now, just because it's a very quite centrist and liberal first Duma, there were many people in the cadet party that were heavy opponents and critics of the Tsar. So this still has the potential to be quite a representative first Duma in terms of social background and demographic group, in terms of representing society, and also representing a range, not a full range, but a good range of political opinion in this first Tsar. So things could still look promising. Then on the eve of the Duma opening, Sergei Witte, its architect, resigns under pressure from reactionaries at court. He was applied under a lot of pressure from conservatives and traditionalists in court, and it led to his resignation, which was really disappointing for members of the Duma because they saw Witte as the person who was most likely to listen to the Duma's views and potentially put them into practice. So that was a real disappointment for many of the Duma's participants and supporters. He was replaced by Ivan Goremykin, who secured a loan from France. Now this is a really pivotal point because a huge loan of 2.25 million francs that was secured just before the Duma opened meant that the government was no longer reliant on the Duma's approval of the national budget. This meant that obviously, if you look at the design of the constitution, it was designed so that each party was dependent on one another, or each body in that constitution was dependent on one another. Well, the government is no longer dependent on the Duma now because it has this huge loan from France. So, the first Duma, in their first address to the throne, pull no punches, and they ask for a long list of huge reforms. They want political amnesty so that they can view their opinions honestly and openly without fear of imprisonment or worse. They wanted the abolition of the upper house because they felt it contradicted the democratic kind of the democratic gist of this whole experiment. They wanted compulsory seizure of lands from the gentry without compensation. They wanted direct suffrage, direct voting for all male members of the population. They wanted the abandonment of emergency laws and the abolition of the death penalty. So that first address to the throne was ambitious, and it was intended to really show what this new Duma was all about. So it probably won't surprise you, but the Tsar found this totally inadmissible and rejected it without question. So this creates a problem for the Duma. The Duma declared a vote of no confidence in the government and demanded the resignation of the Tsar's Council of Ministers. This was simply ignored for up to 10 weeks, and later the Duma was dissolved. It was brought to a close. Gomerikin himself was replaced by Pyotr Stolypin, who had a reputation for dealing with unrest in another district quite severely. So he's got quite a hard line reputation. As a result of this, 200 delegates of the State Duma, 120 cadets, including Prince Lvov, who's pictured, decide that they were going to flee to Viborg in Finland. And from there, they issued an appeal to citizens to refuse to pay taxes or do military service. This received a popular response, and the government punished them by taking the vote away from those offenders and giving them a 3-month prison sentence. So this deprived the cadets of their best leaders, and it would affect their performance in the elections for the second Duma. So that brings to an end the first attempt of the Duma experiment, and in the next video we'll look at the fate of the second, third and fourth Dumas.